Burning Sands. RK equals. Interlude. Shakti. Confusion. Exasperation. Cursing oneself for being a naive fool. Anger. That's how being Shakti felt. Ever since she started actively participating in the war, she had found it harder and harder to center herself when she meditated. The screams of billions dying were echoing through the force, feeding the dark side. Every day more and more people were joining the choir of the murdered, making it that more difficult to keep oneself free of their emotions while meditating. In hindsight, Shakti and the other Jedi Masters should have anticipated it happening. She had seen the records of the wars between the Old Republic and the Sith, of the effect that a prolonged galaxy-spanning conflict had on the Jedi Order. That simply wasn't enough to prepare her for the reality of the war. The sheer senseless, callous destruction and the unimaginable scale of death that inevitably came with it. What she did know was why the Jedi of old were so reluctant to participate in the Republic's wars unless the Sith were involved. Simply feeling the war through the Force while she was training clone troopers on Kamino, while far away of any active battlefield, was more than enough to make ridding herself of her emotions difficult. On the occasions she was near the location of anything but a small-scale skirmish, she could easily feel people's deaths echoing through the Force. And when she actually engaged in combat, it was that much worse. The only thing that helped then was the nature of the enemy, which was composed mostly of droids. That didn't help as much as she had hoped. Shakti still felt the death of the clones under her command, of the ordinary beings engaging on both sides, and the civilians caught in the cauldron of war. As often as not, when countless millions were dying in the span of moments by either design or accident, every Jedi could sense it. Despite all her efforts, the Jedi Master was simply no longer able to completely purge herself of her feelings as she could do before the conflict flared to life. Especially when meditation, which was the exact time for a Jedi to balance himself and set herself free from any emotion. The war had been slowly warping the Jedi. Every time a Jedi engaged in combat, every time an Order member was anywhere near a massacre, they were influenced by the dark side no matter how much they tried to resist it. It frayed the Jedi's control over their emotions. Then he appeared, and it all got much, much worse. A Dark Lord of the Sith, who was anything but what the Jedi were taught to expect. Shakti would have laughed if she could. Instead she just glared at the man who was subtly destroying the Jedi Order from within. The ancient records had warned the future generations of Jedi how dangerous the Sith could be. Those warnings were in fact underestimating the true threat a Dark Lord of the Sith could pose. It wasn't his mastery over the Force and techniques that had become half-forgotten legends. It wasn't his proficiency with a lightsaber that rivaled or perhaps even surpassed the best swordsman in the Order. Oh, no. Those things weren't what made him truly dangerous. It was his dark allure. The strange charisma that he could summon at times. The reasonable way in which he made millennia of Jedi teaching sound as if they were flawed creations, holding the Order members back. When he spoke, the Jedi, especially the younger ones, listened. Instead of scoffing at his attempts to twist everything they were, every principle they stood for, a lot of Jedi considered his words. And an increasing number of them found merit in them. After the horrors a lot of them had felt, witnessed or even participated in, it made a number of Jedi doubt themselves and their teachings. It made them willing to listen when Vale spoke innocently, suggesting another way to do things. Oh, she felt the allure of his words. At a time when even Jedi Masters found it all but impossible to free themselves of their feelings during meditation, impossible to fully center themselves, Vale was promising that they didn't have to. That they weren't failing as Jedi when allowing themselves to feel. That it wasn't wrong. It was what many of the younger ones and some of their elders wanted to hear. It was the same for Shakti. It was a vindication that a deeply buried part of the Togruta sorely needed. A promise that her predator instincts that always made it hard to be a decent, emotion-free Jedi, weren't wrong. Weren't something that she necessarily needed to constantly fight. That her instincts wasn't something to fear. She could see it now. It was so easily to start sliding down a damning path. It felt so right to let herself experience emotions instead of instantly squashing them with a sheer effort of her will. It was sublime. And it almost brought her to damnation. Even now, when Shakti was finally clearly seeing the trap she fell into, it was all she could do to hold the storm of emotions raging within her and not act on them. She trembled with the effort, pressing her lightsaber to Vale's heart. It would be so easily to give in to her righteous anger and end the Sith once and for all. Yet he spoke again, his honeyed words halting her hand for the moment. No matter how she loathed it, the bastard was right. Simply cutting him down in anger. She knew the consequences. That would surely lead to the dark side. What was the alternative? Here he was, at her mercy, an occurrence that was unlikely to happen once that was no longer the case. He would never let himself be so vulnerable again. Shaak Ti knew that she was trapped. Snared as surely as the rest of the council. Legally he had done nothing wrong to warrant her striking him down. Doing so could very well turn the Senate, Chancellor and the Republic and her army against the Jedi. It was something that almost happened when Master Windu apparently saw the truth during the attack on the temple and tried to act on it. A wave of desperation slammed in Shaak Ti and almost instantly fed into her anger. What was the alternative? Watch how Vale continues to tear apart the Order from within? Watch him turn scores of Jedi to the dark side without them suspecting anything being amiss? Allow him to continue to toy with her? To continue manipulating her? She was shaking, losing her doomed fight to contain the confusing storm of emotions threatening to engulf her whole being. Claiming that he wanted her to be free? She almost laughed at the thought. It sounded great, it truly did. It was a lie, of course. Another plot to twist her mind. There was only one little problem. A treacherous voice spoke at the back of her head. Why letting herself freely experience emotions for the first time felt so right? Why did it make her feel complete if it was so wrong? Then Vale leaned even closer and softly kissed her. That threw Shaak Ti for a loop, the unfamiliar sensation making her mind blank for a moment. It was unexpectedly pleasant. It called to the instincts that even now were fighting for control. Shaak Ti growled, a primal sound containing equal amounts of confusion, dark desire and fury. The last vestiges of control she had over her emotions snapped. =RK=, Part 7, Briefing Room 1, Republic Cruiser Chimera, First Assault Fleet Flagship, High orbit over Geonosis. A pulse of raw, wild force energy threw me back. Only instinctively shielding myself from the power release prevented me from slamming into the bulkhead behind me, though it was close. My frayed nerves screamed as too much force ran through my body, but I only grit my teeth and took a step closer to Shaak Ti, who was swaying on her feet. The Jedi Master was in the center of a localized storm of energy which was whipping around her like a small tornado. At the same time the doors slid open, revealing my apprentice. Arya had an ignited lightsaber in hand and a confused expression on her face. HK was a step behind her, his carbine was sweeping the room for threats. "Leave. Make sure we aren't interrupted," I ordered, while concentrating my attention on Shaak Ti. From the corner of my eye I saw Arya frown, but she stiffly nodded nevertheless and left with my assassin on her heels. When the door shut and locked behind them I let out a sigh of relief. The last thing I needed was an interruption. This was going out to be a delicate matter to handle. The emotions I could sense coming from the Jedi Master had risen to a crescendo, a virtual hurricane of unbound and conflicting feelings. My lips twitched upwards in a semblance of a smile as I allowed my senses to brush over the amount of force that Shaak Ti was unwittingly channeling. The raw power at her disposal now that she was no longer binding her feelings was making her even more alluring. Now, how to end this mess without having to kill her, because that would be such a crippling waste. I concentrated, using the force to brush the surface of Shaak Ti's mind. She flinched at the ethereal contact. The power around her contracted, forming a rough defensive barrier between Shaak Ti and the surrounding world. It was a pure reflexive response, nothing that could prevent me reaching her if I wanted. "Shaak Ti," I spoke into her mind, taking advantage of the glaring lack of mental shields, which had collapses when she lost all semblance of control over her emotions. The Jedi flinched and took a step back. Suddenly the cauldron of boiling emotions that was gripping her was being dominated by sheer terror. "I have no intention of hurting you. Unless you tried to stab me with that lightsaber, but let's hope it wouldn't come to that." "Vale," she hissed. "You did this to me." In an instant the fear was drowned by delicious fury. "I'm partially to blame, yes. How is it, to feel? To revel in your emotions for the first time since you were a little girl?" I asked aloud. "This is madness." Shaak Ti stared at me with wild, scared eyes. "Well, you're losing it in a rather spectacular way, though thankfully there isn't any collateral damage to speak of," I quipped. She was back to being furious with me. Yep. Typical Jedi, no idea what to do with her emotions. Fear, desperation, anger, desire, sheer confusion, regret, self-loathing, sense of loss, attraction. The way her emotions were shifting like demented pod racers was giving me a headache. Undoubtedly it was 100 times worse for her. It's all right. There's nothing wrong with allowing yourself to feel emotions. Doing so don't lead to the dark side. I took a step forward, while doing my best to project a sense of calm and security through the Force. Close your eyes. Concentrate on a single feeling. Let yourself experience it instead of fighting it. Let yourself feel. I muttered softly and took another step forward. It's too much. Shark T whispered with a desperation-laden voice. The Force responded, lashing wildly around her and leaving rents in the bulkheads. I staggered as a wave of power slammed into my defenses, but continued to slowly get closer to the confounded Jedi. It's not. You're stronger than this. You can face your emotions, revel in them without losing yourself, I whispered. I can't. It's wrong. She shook her head in confusion. Is it? Does it feel wrong? Or are you afraid that for the first time everything feels right, even if you don't know how to handle it? I know it's confusing. Another step and I was in a hand's reach from Shark T. Her emotions shifted again and this time she looked lost and vulnerable. I frowned. I hated seeing her like that. I moved even closer and gently placed my hands on her shoulders. Her head snapped up and she looked at me with her huge eyes. Confusion. Attraction. Danger. Mistrust/trust. Desire. Anger. Her swirling feelings continued to bombard me as I softly rubbed her shoulders, trying to calm her down. Let it go. Stop fighting your emotions, I whispered. Without thinking I raised my right hand and gently cupped her cheek. It's all right. Why? What did I ever do to you? Shark T asked. You fascinate me. Your strength, your determination. Especially the glimpses I've seen from the woman who was hidden under all those layers of Jedi indoctrination. I'm not your enemy, Shark T. Especially not now, when you're finally free. Then there is the fact that you're a gorgeous woman too. I smirked in the end, earning myself a soft snort. You have a strange way of showing it. The amusement was gone as fast as it appeared. You broke me, she muttered. A profound sense of loss. Shame. Failure. On the contrary. You're finally whole. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Anger. Confusion. Satisfaction mixed with loathing. I broke the most important tenet of the code. Shark T shouted in my face and started shacking. I'm not worth of being a Jedi Master and it's all because of you. You don't believe that? Not really, I stated. Listen to your heart. I can sense it in you. You don't believe that letting your emotions run free is wrong. What do you know? Have you gone against everything you've been taught? Shark T snapped at me. I smiled. Checkmate. Yes. I leaned forward until our noses were almost touching. I've told you a few things about the Empire I served. About my fellow Sith and their mistaken interpretation of our code. Of my intentions once I ascended to the Dark Council, though that plan was thrown away by my excursion to the future. An apprentice killing their master. The warped self-destructing internal politics that doomed the Empire even after the Republic and the Jedi were militarily defeated. As a Sith, those were things I should have approved of. You know that I hated that nonsense and I would have changed if I wasn't sent to the present. Or died trying. I added quietly. So yes, I know exactly where you stand. The fact that the majority of your order swears by their precious Jedi code doesn't make it right or sensible. Shark T closed her eyes. I didn't need the Force to know that her mind was spinning. Freedom is a precious thing, Shark T. A wonderful and terrible thing. Please don't throw it away now that you found it. What do you want? She sighed tiredly. Why are you doing this to me? I know. She growled. I can hear it whispering. I could feel a part of it within me. The dark side. Yet. I don't think I've fallen, though a lot of Jedi will disagree. She frowned in confusion. Fallen? No, far from it. As far as the dark side goes, at least now you can meet her on a level playing field. It has always been there, even if the most of the time you couldn't hear her clearly. Shark T's frown deepened. I could see understanding and confusion in her eyes, even a trace of horror. You could have turned me just now. Easily. Yes. Why? Because I'm interested in you, not the twisted fallen Jedi I would have on my hands if I had turned you. Being a true Sith doesn't mean that you fall to the dark side, for that would be a failure of which precious few had ever recovered. It means that she is our servant, our greatest, most terrible and dangerous tool. Dangerous for your enemies and yourself. Finally you understand. I beamed. The dark side is a double-edged sword. However, when using it in combination with the light, when we use the Force itself, then it finally sets us free. Free. Shakti repeated with a faraway look in her eyes. The storm of emotions that had been gripping her for some time started to slowly abate. I could feel her relax a bit in my arms. I couldn't help myself. I crossed the tiny distance separating us and kissed her. After a moment of confusion, Shakti leaned into my touch and returned the kiss. Anger. Pleasure. Confusion. Desire. Contentment. Need. I could see her eyes darken with feelings she had never allowed herself to experience before. Damn, her taste was simply intoxicating. A sexy glow emanated from her chest as she pried her lips away from mine. After all, you do want to get under my robes. Shakti glared at me. I'm a Sith. I'm selfish like that. Damn, that woman was making me lose my better judgment. I see. She growled in such a way that sent a pleasant shiver up my spine. I find myself feeling selfish too. Shakti growled and slammed her lips into mine. Burning Sands. =RK=. Part 8. Briefing Room 1. Republic Cruiser Chimera. First Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. This was a mistake. Shakti, who was currently using my bare chest as a pillow, sighed. While I would love to disagree, there will be consequences. I muttered in her ear. I knew better than to hope that our escapade would go unnoticed. Master, the conference is supposed to start in 5 minutes. HK announced from behind the sealed door. I'll be activating the holo transmitters in there then. He added gleefully, the cheeky bastards. I'm starting to dislike your droid more and more every time he speaks. Who built it anyway? T grumbled and shifted a bit in a rather delicious manner. That would be me? Figures. Only a Sith could have built that thing. I'm usually proud of him, though he can be a pain in the backside from time to time. You don't say. Now what? Shakti groaned and rolled off me to lay on the table. Things got a bit more complicated. I shrugged. At least she had regained some measure of control over her feelings, because the storm that was screaming to at my emphatic sense was subdued, almost down to the level of what a normal person usually felt. You don't say. So you got me in the end. Shakti grumbled. Did I? You were rather enthusiastic. I snorted and rubbed the bite marks on my left shoulder. The less said about the scratches on my back the better. I shouldn't have lost control in such a way. Hey, I'm not complaining. Of course not. I just had sex with a Sith. Shakti groaned. 4 minutes and counting, HK declared gleefully. You know, he'll actually do it. The damn menace actually almost pulled a similar stunt with half the Dark Council waiting for me to contact them. Fresher. I need time to think. Shakti groaned and stood up. I took a moment to appreciate her mostly naked form, before I got myself moving too. If we continued this conversation, I was likely to piss her off one way or another, which wasn't a great idea considering the time and place. =HK=. Boss, you're fucked. HK cheerfully informed me. Yes, I just was. What's your point? I asked while doing my best to remove any trace of my extracircular activities with Shakti from my clothes. 1. She's a Jedi Master. I'm very well aware of the fact. 2nd, you had sex with her just after she had a mental breakdown. I noticed that too. Shakti pressing her lightsaber to my heart and being a hairbreadth from activating it isn't something that suddenly slipped my mind. That's my point. She came near to terminating you before you were sleeping with her. I've been in a similar situation with a lot of Sith, Jedi and soldiers. Not to mention the occasional assassin or Imperial intelligence agent. You didn't care about most of them beyond getting in their pants and whatever manipulation you had going on at the time. HK deadpanned. Your point is? Not until Ashara. I ignored that jab. The woman you just fucked isn't your wife. I'm well aware of the fact. I growled and glared at the assassin droid. Make your criffing point. Are you, really? Let's see, Togruta, with more than a passing resemblance to Ashara Vale, Nazavros. Then there's her personality, which would be quite similar if it wasn't for all the dumb things she's been fed as a Jedi. Need I go on? That gave me pause. Well, yeah. Shark T looked somewhat like my wife, which wasn't a surprise. She was my type of Togruta, and that's why I did pay her a bit more attention than her status as a Jedi Master and my minder would have warranted. As far as her personality goes, yep, there were the odd moments when she acted like I would have expected from Ashara, but beside that they were completely different. Right? I looked myself in the mirror. Yeah, who was I kidding? Griff. Fan-criffing-tastic. That's my point, Master. At least was she any good? Hell yes. Good enough to make up for the trouble that your stunt will undoubtedly cause? It will depend on the Order's reaction when they find out. Well, then. We might have to kick out Nightfall, HK cheerfully announced. Despite their rather inspired attempts, the Jedi haven't yet destroyed their reputation enough to make such an eventuality go out without a hitch. Besides, I have high hopes for some of them. Master, I know you rather well. You've always planned to get rid of the Jedi Order. In its current state, that would actually be an act of mercy. I shrugged. Besides, why destroy them when you can make them join you? That's an issue. As things stand, you aren't the one who would be blamed. Besides, just think about it, no more Jedi giving you a headache. Perhaps I shouldn't have reprogrammed you to despise them so much after Ashara was murdered. Nonsense, Master. I liked her, as much as I could like a biological organism. For murdering her, I was going to kill as many Jedi as I could, even before you get your hands on my programming. Enough about my personal life and schemes. My shock troopers. Report. They aren't half bad. For meat bags. Ashe equals. Briefing Room 1. Republic Cruiser Chimera. First Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. Vale. Master T. What the criff happened in orbit? Obi-Wan asked a moment after his image appeared. You felt that? Shark T winced. Nothing that is of concern for the task at hand. I interrupted them. Who either of us slept with wasn't their business, though at least a few of them would try to do it. I was made to believe that our overall plan for the ground campaign is working so far. That's correct, General. William Maxtro's hologram nodded. While the extensive tunnel networks covering most of our advance routes have been troublesome, we're actually ahead of schedule. The orbital strikes taking out most enemy concentrations before they could engage us sure help. That won't last for long. Within 2 days we'll be reaching our primary targets, and then it will get ugly. Colonel Pell added. We had to improvise while dealing with various shielded strongpoints already. I'm afraid that we'll have to carry out a frontal assault on our primary objectives or settle for prolonged siege. The latter isn't an option. We need to secure our objectives and pull out of here ASAP. Within weeks the CIS will have enough spare space forces to go on the offensive again. This fleet will be needed then at the latest, I stated. I didn't need to elaborate what would happen if the battle for Geonosis wasn't resolved by then. Without orbital superiority, the CIS and the locals would have enough numbers to bleed dry our armies on the ground. The problem was that an inevitable frontal assault would have similar effect. Unfortunately, I didn't have neither the assets at hand nor the political clout necessary to resolve the problem in a different matter. Which meant that we would have to improvise. I smiled. If he somehow hadn't figured it out by now, it was guaranteed that Sidious soon would know about my origin anyway. Some of you know about my past, where I came from. I looked at the assembled Republic officers and Jedi. During the wars I fought in, both the Jedi and Sith used a rather simple, but nonetheless effective strategy. Strike teams led by Force adepts would be inserted groundside and go after strategic objectives. Both sides captured whole planets that way even when we knew exactly what to look for. How do you expect us to pull that off? Audi Mundi asked. We'll be using all available stealth-capable armor. Another 2,000 units will be shipped here in about 2 days' time. We go in and blow up the shield generators. That way we'll have unrestricted orbital and air support. In fact, most of the industrial areas will be taken out that way. However, That won't be practical as far as the experimental factories are concerned. Why not? Burning them from orbit sounds good to me. One of the clone commanders quipped. We need the schematics for the new droids those places will be building. The intelligence types believe them to be something special, and it could be vital if we can examine them in detail, preferably before facing them in combat. That's a good point. Shark T frowned at me. She's been unusually cold after returning from her own trip to the fresher and had been refusing to meet my eyes. She was also rather pissed off at the situation at hand, something that I had the sneaking suspicion that the Togruta would blame on me. For good reasons too, but that was beside the point. What units would be available for this assault? Master Mundi asked. All commando units in system, and we'll be drawing primary from our recon platoons. Makes sense. They have extensive training in infiltration tactics. Another clone officer nodded. We'll have to plan both the covert assaults and how to best exploit them, Obi-Wan stated. Contingencies for those which fail, I added. I had no illusion that all of the insertions would be successful. That too. Ashe equals. Interlude, Dream's Eye. Sith Academy. Korriban. It was vexing. My master was officially dead, playing some criffing mind games along with the rest of the Dark Council. That's why I was back on this dust ball, in need to fight for the recognition of my new prospective master, a Sith Lord named Zash. Quite the character that one, if all the rumors I've heard during the years were even half true. Slave, you're late. The Academy overseer that was supposed to receive Zash's potential apprentices glared at me, making me twitch in annoyance. Oh, yeah. I forgot to mention. As far as most people in the Empire knew, I had perished with Barras, so I was supposedly a newly minded poor bastard who was thrown to the Tau Kata to be torn apart. Whoever was in charge of my backstory was apparently quite lazy, the bastard, because he had mine ripped off with just a few cosmetic changes. So I was posing as what I used to be, a former slave who had manifested his Force talents in a rather bloody and gruesome way by tearing his owner to shreds. I grinned at that memory. It was crude, but rather enjoyable piece of work. I hope you don't think you're special. Harkon, the irritating overseer, glowered at me. It will be shame if your freedom went to your head. He trailed off when I simply patted my lightsaber and smiled at him. Long story short, I was on my way to the tomb of an ancient Sith Lord, a Junkapor or something. Some kind of a prophet had commandeered the place, and Zash wanted one of us poor bastards to gain his approval and advice. Finding the tomb itself wasn't particularly hard. I just had to ask one of the patrols cleaning up the annual infestation of local wildlife about an insane old man living in one of the nearby caves. The soldiers, not being idiots, knew the location as a place to avoid at all costs. After all, no one in his right mind was keen on crossing a Sith who was apparently crazier than normal. That was hazardous for one's health. So the prophet. It turned out that he was an ancient-looking wiry human, calling himself Spindle. He had half a dozen apprentices he had gathered from somewhere, and they all were inhabiting a part of the tomb that might pass for barely habitable if you squinted very, very hard. The slave? He muttered when I approached him. Spindle turned around and frowned at me. Here for your trial. He trailed off, while studying me. You weren't here to learn the path of the Sith from this doddering old man. You're rather well familiar with them, aren't you? At least he was perceptive. I'm actually here for a breath of fresh air, I quipped. Don't play the fool, it demeans us both. Even I'm not here for the sheer pleasure of it. You want my mark of approval for your master. Oh, that? I can tear it from your cold, dead body. No, I want something else, Lord Spindle. I smirked. The old man froze for a moment. He never said his name, and there were precious few people currently on Korriban who knew his actual identity. Ah, I see. So he sent you, didn't he? Yes, your former apprentice isn't particularly happy that you somehow still live. I was his master. The bond is still here, so I know that Barras lives. A mere extension of my will, and my lightsaber regally jumped into my waiting hand. At the same time I sent a powerful wall of force at the old man, which almost caught him off guard. However, Spindle hadn't survived this long by being anything but a dangerous murderous bastard like the rest of us. He raised a hand just in time to deflect my attack, which shattered to a bunch of ancient pottery. Not for long. I smiled for the first time after receiving my latest mission. I raised my left hand and clutched my fingers into a fist a moment before I vaulted forward. Spindle chocked for an instant as his internal organs were constrained, yet he managed to dispel my second attack and raise his own blade just in time to parry a downward slash. Still, he was pushed back by the sheer power of my strike. My smile grew. While his mastery of the force surpassed mine, I was younger, at my prime, while his body was betraying him. That's why I let go of my attempt to directly attack him with my powers and instead used them to further augment my physical advantages. My saber became a crimson blur raining upon the defenses of the old man. It took me mere seconds to batter down his guard, not enough time for his apprentices to process the fact that I had the sheer gall to attack their master, much less to interfere, though they were finally reacting. I could feel their sheer outrage and fury at my actions and their approach. My next strike nearly tore the lightsaber from Spindle's hands, leaving him open for my next attack. I was about to deliver a killing blow when he sent a jolt of lightning at me, staggering me for a split second. Just long enough for him to take a step back and put back his weapon in a defensive position. And his closest apprentices were almost upon me. I drew the force around me like a cloak and then released it in an explosive demonstration of sheer power. The apprentices flew back like twigs caught by a hurricane and even Spindle was forced back. My smile widened when I heard a pair of blaster pistols discharge and the signatures of 2 apprentices vanished. My distraction had allowed Veta to sneak up to the young idiots and shoot 2 of them in the back. The relic I had gifted her that hid her from the force sure helped too. A cry of distress, a wave of heat followed by deafening explosion. My back was secure and I could concentrate on my quarry. It was just in time to be blasted back by a wave of purple lighting. While I intercepted most of the attack with my blade, tendrils of living darkness clawed at my hands making me wince in pain. I released a pulse of pure force, which broke the enemy assault and jumped at the bastard. I slammed into Spindle with a jolt that shook me. Suddenly I was back in my quarters on the Chimera. I bolted upright acting on instinct and had my right hand wrapped over the throat of whoever awoke me. My free arm glowed in the dark with the lighting dancing over my fingers. Only sensing the familiar presence of Shark T stopped my hand from slamming into her chest and sending enough electricity into her to stop her heart. "What the criff, woman?" I exclaimed and released her. She stared at me with huge eyes. I could sense the fear creeping within Shark T's heart when she started comprehending how close she got to dying. Burning Sands =RK=. Part 9. General Vale's Quarters. Republic Cruiser Chimera. First Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. I slowly unclenched my fingers and removed my hand from Shark T's throat. At the same time I left the lighting dancing over my free hand harmlessly dissipate. Did no one ever mention to you that waking up veterans while they're dreaming might be hazardous? I frowned at the Jedi Master. Especially if you don't do it from distance? I groaned and fell back into my bed. Obviously. Shark T deadpanned and glared at me as if it was entirely my fault. Unless you came here because you suddenly find me irresistible, I smirked, which given what just happened even if true won't get me laid tonight. What exactly do you want? Only in your dreams, Vale. I came to talk. T glared at me. You gave me a lot of pleasant things to dream about, so it's all right. What do you want to talk about? I winked at her. If you're trying to be fun, it's not working. I'm still half asleep. Not to mention that I was still recovering from the battle meditation, so I actually needed my nap time. My being nice button is currently stuck away from the being nice position. Hint, next time you want to awake this grumpy Sith, at least bring a cup of caf. You're impossible. I've been told so before. It was by another Togruta Jedi too. Shark T growled at me again, and this time there was nothing sexy in the sound. It was all frustration and exasperation. It's all those feelings. I can't make them stop and it gets worse. She trailed off, sounding almost scared. According to my emphatic sense, she actually was, once her anger at me petered out. I'm listening. I sat into my bed, looked her in the eyes and frowned. For some reason I didn't like the look of fear I saw there, even if should have made the darker parts of my mind enjoy it thanks to the dark side. I could hear it. Whispering at the back of my head. What did you do to me? Asked. That's certainly unexpected. I frowned and studied her face more carefully. She looked quite tired. On edge. You know what's happening? There was a hint of hope in her voice. Yeah. I'm just surprised that it hit you so soon and apparently rather hard. I nodded. That fact had a few quite interesting applications for the delectable Jedi Master. What do you actually know about the dark side? Know for a fact, I mean, and not just what you've been fed at the temple? I asked, while doing my best to shield my amusement away. I was almost 100% sure that I would find the Jedi's interpretation hilarious, but laughing my ass off at them right now would be counterproductive in a lot of ways. It's the dark side, she exclaimed, looking at me as if the answer was obvious. Humor me, please. I spoke calmly and stared at her. Shark T huffed but continued speaking. The dark side corrupts everything it touches. While it gives a shortcut to power, that is at the price of one's sanity and principles, even if sometimes the consequences take a bit of time to manifest. It twists you, turns you against everyone and everything you hold dear. She gave me a pointed look. Its powers are no match for a fully trained Jedi who has the light side as her ally. Further, thanks to a Jedi's training and ability to keep their emotions at bay, we have advantage when facing a dark side wielder. We don't make mistakes in the heat of passion that could be exploited to bring us down. That's it? That's the short version. We would be here for at least a week if I'm to give you the long one. Well, there are at least a few grains of truth in that explanation. I trailed off. That actually wasn't particularly surprising. However, if this was what even the Jedi Master could tell me on the top of their head, any half-competent Sith from my time would have had a great time of twisting today's Jedi until he had turned most of them. Relatively easy too. You couldn't really protect against the dark side if you weren't reasonably familiar with it. In hindsight, today's Jedi were actually lucky that Sidious planned to exterminate them wholesale instead of going the more traditional way and doing his best to build an army of fallen Jedi. The latter would have been even more successful than his original plans if handled correctly. Where to start? You have to understand the nature of the dark side in order to handle it with any reasonable expectation of not eventually falling. That got her undivided attention. Considering that I very much prefer you sane, I'll have to teach it about it and you will listen. My voice brook no argument. Shark T's anger flared, but she was able to put it back under a reasonable amount of control. For the moment at least. Calling the dark side evil is a misconception, though anyone with intact mental faculties could see where that comes from. The truth about it is simple. It doesn't care for the morality of most sapient beings in the galaxy. Do you consider a hurricane to be evil? An earthquake? A storm? The Force is a part of nature. By definition neither part is good or evil. However, they emphasize different aspects of nature, different mindsets. How so? You don't see Jedi going around, torturing and killing people. Again, with a morality that doesn't really apply in this case. It is true that the light side excels in healing, protection, conflict resolution. On a larger perspective, its wielders are usually better for maintaining a community and working for the betterment of the group as a whole. It emphasizes the betterment of the whole over that of the individual. It excels during peacetime and in maintaining that peace. As you said, mastery over it comes after a long time of training, though that period would be quite shorter if you people weren't too busy trying to cut yourselves from emotion. At least while the Jedi as a whole kept their heads out of their backsides. When they generally forgot how to do that, we eventually got things as today's Coruscant order. I didn't think that it was possible for a Sith to praise the light side. Shark T was looking at me strangely, as if trying to make sense of me. Only an arrogant fool dismisses a fundamental aspect of the Force, and it's true that many Sith weren't particularly bright once their newfound power got to their heads. I shrugged. Let's continue. The dark side. It requires quite different mentality to understand and accept. It's selfish. It promotes the well-being of the individual and that of a small group over any larger body. By its nature, that's not any worse than what the light side. It gives one power much faster than the average Jedi could achieve. Going by raw strength in the Force, someone who aligns themselves with the dark side could gain in weeks, usually months, what a Jedi takes years in training to achieve. You're correct that sometimes that training does give a Jedi the upper hand, though that goes only when dealing with Darksiders who are new to the Force and haven't received the benefit of competent training themselves. As you can guess, there's a catch. You all go insane eventually? Shark T gave me a deadpan look. I smirked. She didn't believe that I was particularly sane-ish, and she did have a point, though I really couldn't lay most of my issues at the feet of the dark side, though I cheerfully blamed the Sith who trained me, the criffing bastards. That was a subtle but important distinction. Why is that the case? I asked her, while giving her an amused smile. Just telling you that's because of the dark side won't fly, would it? No. As I said before, the dark side is selfish, a quality that gets reinforced in anyone who brushes with it often. It's a subtle thing at first. Usually. As I said, she's individualistic. She wants her wielders to be powerful, independent, to break all their chains and be free to make their own choices. In that regard, the Sith Code is more accurate than any version of the Jedi one I've seen so far. The problem lies in how that's expressed and the way most people interpret it. It usually gets quite messy. You don't say. Shark T gave me a flat look. I can almost hear it whispering in the back of my head. I could feel people dying on the planet below us, their pain, fear and despair. It feels pleasant. Shark T shouted at me and started passing around my room. How can you call it anything but evil? Did you ever stop for a moment and wonder why it feels that way? I asked. I was too busy trying to keep myself from enjoying people's suffering. I take it as a no. As I pointed out, the dark side is selfish. It wants its wielders to survive, grow more powerful. She feeds of emotions of feelings. Is it so surprising that she makes people feel good at overwhelming and crushing their enemies? At reveling at others' fear? Because let me tell you, you're much more likely to survive when facing terrified foes than a group who keeps their cool. At the same vein, when someone with access to her is afraid, that very emotion gives them power. Anger? It clouds a person's judgment unless handled properly. It also makes you more likely to strike at any perceived danger, fuels your strength. In a lot of cases it makes you more likely to survive. There are no doubts while you're furious. No what-ifs. No hesitation that might get you killed. What about the cruelty that most Sith are known for? Oh, we enjoy it, very much, and you can't even blame the dark side for every single instance. Look beyond just the acts. What are the consequences? It makes us feared. Less likely for someone to oppose or stand in our way if they have an acceptable alternative. Makes them apprehensive if they fight us anyway. Until you reach a certain level, the path of the dark side is full of trade-offs. For everything I pointed out, there are cons, aren't there, Shark T? More than I think about right now. Less from where I stand, though they're undeniably there. You have to accept your feelings, learn to channel your passions. Will it ever stop? That seductive whispering at the back of your mind? I shook my head. It's always there. Whispering, promising. If you let you rule you, the dark side will grant you more power than you've ever felt. At the same time, it will twist you. When let to go to its logical concussion, submitting to the dark side will make you see yourself as the only person that matters in the universe. For you, everything else will become playthings at best, all the while you'll enjoy their pain and suffering. And you have the gall not to call the dark side evil? It's not. She's a force of nature, caring not for what the beings in the galaxy consider moral. It simply wants its wielders to be as powerful as possible and to give them the best chance for survival. To do so, she drives them on the path of individual strength and ability. It makes it so that you won't ever regret crushing a possible threat, that you would love doing it. That's why I always say that the dark side isn't an ally. It's a tool, one that's very powerful and dangerous. Why would anyone want to embrace the dark side? Why not, as long as you don't let it rule you? Shark T, it's a brutal galaxy out there, and I'm not talking about the war. It's easy to be saints when you live in the temple, with all your basic needs taken care of. It's quite different when you've had to scrap for your next meal, to fight for your survival on a daily basis. That's true even for Coruscant, the one of the jewels of the galaxy. What was the last time you've been in one of the lower sections? The dark side is something that many people in the galaxy would eagerly embrace because it will grant them the power to survive. To no longer be weak, to cease being victims. I've never thought about it like that. But why don't they join the Order? With the exception of Skywalker, what was the last time you trained someone who wasn't a toddler? What about the hardened Force sensitives you've missed? The ones who had lived through hell and had a rather different worldview than what the Order would find acceptable? You'd never train them as Jedi. Too old. Too dangerous. They are a ripe material for making Sith. That's madness. How could you defend the dark side after all you just said? You've fought in the Great War. You know firsthand of all the atrocities the Sith committed. Why it always has to be light and dark, black and white? What about shades of grey? If there's one thing that I've learned about the galaxy, it's that things are seldom as either the Jedi or typical Sith portray them. I sighed in exasperation. Light side, dark side. Those are the two sides of the same coin. Left alone they lead to either stagnation or self-destruction. Unless used in measure, the ultimate end is the same in the long term. I laughed. Do you know that I had the same conversation with my wife shortly after I persuaded her to come to my side? Your wife? A Jedi? Shark T looked at me. I saw her when you showed me those memories. I still find it hard to believe that a Jedi married you. She saw the truth of the matter. I shrugged. Ashara. I smiled. She never turned, no matter how persuasive I was the times. She kept me sane. She understood. I spoke wishfully. Damn, I missed her. You or your view of the Force? Both. We used the two sides of the Force and we were stronger for it. She proved to everyone that you could use the dark side and not be twisted by her. That terrified a lot of Jedi. Made them question their beliefs, which in turn made them easier to turn to our side. It was one of the reasons why we were left mostly alone by the Sith, who were nominally my superiors. The fact that I was a Lord of the Sith in my own right at the time, with my ascension to the Dark Council as a very real possibility, sure helped in that regard. It sounds so easily. It's not. But it's worth it in the end. Shark T, this war. It's going to get much worse before it ends. If we can hold on for the next few months, we'll be equally matched with the Confeds for at least a year or two, before we could conceivably start turning the tide. By using the dark side as your tool, by embracing your emotions, you're that much more likely to survive what's to come. I don't want to see you hurt or worse. She sat on the bed next to me, looking lost. I'm not her, you know. I'm well aware. Actually, HK made that same point yesterday. Huh? I would never have thought that he'll do something like that. How do I deal with all this? One step at a time. I slid closer to Shark T and gave her a gentle hug. Dealing with your emotions. It's not something that can be learned overnight. Nor is managing the dark side. What about your apprentice? I could feel it in her. She revels in it. She's very much a work in progress. While dangerous, the dark side is her best bet to survive for now. The deal I made for Arya. She either pulls her weight or gets thrown to your council for a trial. What do you think they would do when she refuses to renounce being a Sith to become one of your kind? She did lead the attack on the temple. But I can see where you go with it. She's a clone. Arya never had a choice in the matter, did she? On the contrary. She had the same choice I was given when I was carted to the academy on Korriban. And what's that? A rather prolonged and nasty death or becoming a monster. I chose to live, no matter how many people had to die for it. While I do have a lot of regrets, that's not one of it. That's not what a Jedi would have done. No. I would have been a terrible Jedi anyway. I could almost understand. Shark T muttered quietly. The very thought of putting my own survival before that of people I could have saved. It would never have crossed my mind before. While I'm sure that I would make the same choice now, I would protect people with my life without regret. I can see it. That someone could value their life above the well-being or even survival of strangers. It's not something I think I'll ever do, but for some reason I no longer see making such a choice as being despicable. She shrugged. Follow your conscience. The rest, no matter if it's the Jedi Code, the Sith teachings or anything else. It's secondary at best. That simple? It worked for Ashara, and she was the only other Togruta female that I knew to be in your shoes. She sounds like someone I would have liked. You would have, I muttered. For the next few minutes we just stood there, deep in our own thoughts. Holding Shark T made me feel content, calmer than I've been in some time. I smiled, enjoying her warmth, feeling the slow beat of her heart. What happens now? She asked quietly. We talk. We get to know each other and see where it goes from there. You're a strange Sith, Del-Qatar. Are you sure that this isn't just an elaborate plot to get under my robes again? While I would rather like that, just as you obviously did, I won't force you into something you might not be ready for. You'd hate me for it in the long term. When I have a handle on my emotions, you mean? Yep. I could still feel them dying. I could almost hear their screams of pain and fear. It's worse than almost anything I've sensed before. Now that you're no longer suppressing your emotions as a matter of fact, your connection to the Force is stronger, sharper. What you feel is a natural consequence of that. Tomorrow afternoon we're supposed to deploy for the final push. I don't know how I'll handle it firsthand. I pulled her closer to me and kissed her temple. It will be hard. My advice is to channel your feelings. The anger you feel at all the deaths brought by the Confederacy, the fear you feel from the people on Geonosis, everything. Use it with a purpose in mind. So you could bring a faster end of the fighting. In the end, that's what really matters. By winning this war in the fastest, most efficient way, we'll do the most good. That way less people will die, there will be smaller amount of wounded and crippled. Less lives will be destroyed. It's never that simple. No. People make mistakes. The other side gets a vote, that's why we call them the enemy. The war warps everything it touches. Think about it, people can't comprehend the scale at which we fight even in this day and age. Billions in the double digits. That's how many people had died already and the war hadn't really hit its stride yet. Once our economy is fully on war footing and we start building up our armies and fleets, it will get much, much worse. Sometimes I wonder why we fight. Because each of us believe in something worth protecting or achieving. Because not doing so would be worse in the long term. Because no matter how bad this war goes, I have the feeling that what's to come would be orders of magnitude worse. Why do you fight, Delcatar? It's not the Republic, that much I know. I have my reasons. I fight for the future. That's not an answer. You're simply lacking the context. One day you would know. Shark T's heartbeat and breathing slowed down as she fell asleep in my hands. I gently pulled her next to me in the bed and used the Force to throw the cover over us. I smiled, feeling content to simply hold the sleeping woman, content to forge the war for a bit or the fact that tomorrow all hell was going to break loose on Geonosis.